What if getting sick meant being declared dead to your community? What if your family believed that fever burning through your body was God's judgment? What if a simple infection didn't just threaten your life, it could exile you from everything you knew? 2,000 years ago, in the world Jesus walked, there was no understanding of germs. No antibiotics, no hospitals. Sickness wasn't a medical emergency. It was a spiritual crisis that could destroy your entire existence. A mother watching her child burn with fever had no way to bring down the temperature. A man developing strange spots on his skin faced not just physical suffering, but complete banishment from his village. A woman bleeding continuously wasn't just losing her health, she was losing her place in society, her ability to worship, her connection to God Himself. This wasn't a world where you caught a cold and recovered in a week. This was a world where every scrape, every cough, every unexplained pain carried the weight of potential catastrophe, where survival demanded not just physical endurance, but spiritual reckoning. Step into a village in 1st century Palestine. The air itself seems thick with danger you cannot see. Water comes from cisterns that collect rainwater, along with everything that washes into them. Animal waste from rooftops, debris from streets, contamination that turns every drink into a gamble. Villages had no systematic sanitation. Human waste mixed with animal waste in streets and disposal pits, seeping into soil and water sources. Families lived in 1 or 2 small rooms, but they weren't alone. Goats, sheep, and donkeys slept in attached spaces or on lower levels, providing warmth through cold nights. Parents, children, and livestock shared the same air, the same space, the same diseases. When sickness struck one member of the household, it spread through everyone under that low stone roof. Food spoiled quickly in the heat. Preservation meant salting, drying, imperfect methods that often failed. Flies moved freely from waste piles to food bowls, carrying invisible death on their wings. Washing hands was a ritual act performed for religious purity, not because anyone understood it prevented disease. There was no concept of germs, no knowledge of bacteria or viruses. Sickness came from bad air, miasma, or from spiritual forces. Divine punishment, demonic attack, an imbalance of bodily humors inherited from Greek medicine. This was the invisible battlefield where ordinary people fought for their lives every day. Not against enemies they could see and fight, but against microscopic killers they couldn't comprehend. The question wasn't whether you would get sick. The question was whether you would survive it. The fever arrives without warning. Your child's skin burns to the touch, but you have no way to cool it, no understanding of what causes it, no medicine to break it. You can only watch as the temperature climbs higher, knowing that if it doesn't break soon, you will lose them. In the marshy lowlands around the Sea of Galilee and the Jordan Valley, malaria struck in recurring waves. Victims shivered violently, then burned with fever, then shivered again in endless cycles. Families recognized the pattern, but could do nothing to stop it. The disease came from the bad air of swampy places, they believed. They had no way to know about the mosquitoes that carried death in their bite. Contaminated water brought typhoid and dysentery. These killers announced themselves with severe cramping, violent diarrhea, and dehydration that could claim a life in days. Children were especially vulnerable. A bad batch of water could wipe out multiple families in a single week. The symptoms were unmistakable, but by the time they appeared, treatment was often impossible. Tuberculosis moved differently. It consumed slowly, methodically. The victim coughed constantly, lost weight steadily, and grew weaker month by month. Families watched their loved ones waste away over seasons, sharing cramped quarters where everyone breathed the same infected air. They called it consumption because it seemed to devour people from within. These were the mysterious fevers that terrorized households. Parents had no thermometers to measure the danger, no medications to fight the infection, no medical knowledge to guide their response. They could only wait and pray while invisible killers decided who would live and who would die. In a world without germ theory, fever wasn't just a symptom. It was a supernatural force that required supernatural intervention. The diagnosis comes from a priest, not a physician, and it changes everything. The man with patches of discolored skin on his arms approaches the religious authorities as required by law. The priest examines the lesions, consults the detailed regulations in Leviticus, and renders his verdict, zarath, unclean. What we translate as leprosy was actually a broad category that included any chronic, disfiguring skin condition. True, Hansen's disease existed, but it was rare. More commonly, people faced this devastating diagnosis for psoriasis, severe eczema, fungal infections, vitiligo, or persistent scabies. The specific disease didn't matter. The social consequences were identical. The man must immediately tear his clothes and leave them torn. He cannot cut his hair or beard. He must live outside the town boundaries, separated from family, friends, and community. When anyone approaches, he must cover his mouth and shout the warning, "Unclean! Unclean!" This isn't medical quarantine. This is ritual banishment. The concern isn't contagion, it's spiritual contamination. The person with zarath cannot enter the temple, participate in festivals, or join community gatherings. They are cut off from the religious life that gives meaning to existence. Families face an impossible choice. Maintaining contact with their afflicted relative makes them ritually suspect, but abandoning them violates fundamental bonds of kinship. Some families secretly bring food and supplies to the outskirts of town. Others make the heartbreaking decision to treat their loved one as already dead. The person with skin disease experiences social death while still breathing. They watch their former life continue. Without them from a distance, they cannot cross. Children grow up. Harvests come and go. Festivals celebrate life and faith. In a community that no longer acknowledges their existence, recovery requires another priestly examination and elaborate purification rituals involving birds, cedar wood, scarlet thread, and multiple offerings. But for many, the skin never fully heals. The exile becomes permanent. In this world, your skin was your passport to society. When it failed you, everything else failed with it. Blindness transforms you from a person into a burden. The trachoma starts as irritation, eyes that water and itch from the constant flies. But the bacterial infection spreads, scarring the inside of the eyelids until they turn inward. Your own eyelashes scrape against your corneas with every blink, slowly destroying your sight. There is no surgery to correct it, no antibiotics to stop it. Malnutrition steals vision differently. Without enough vitamin A, night blindness develops first. Then day vision fails as the corneas soften and eventually rupture. Children born into poverty often face this fate before they can even understand what they're losing. The sun itself becomes an enemy. Decades of intense Middle Eastern light create cataracts that cloud vision until the world becomes a blur of shadows. Desert winds carry sand that scratches and scars delicate eye tissue. Simple infections that could be easily treated today progress until they destroy sight permanently. A blind person cannot work the fields, practice a trade, or contribute to household survival. They become entirely dependent on family charity or public begging. You'll find them at city gates and temple entrances, hands outstretched, voices calling for mercy from strangers. Broken bones heal crooked when no one knows how to set them properly. A shepherd who falls from a cliff may survive, but his twisted leg makes walking agony. He cannot tend flocks or travel to markets. Paralysis from injury or diseases like polio creates similar helplessness. Deafness isolates people from the spoken word that carries all learning and commerce. In a world without sign language or written communication for common people, the deaf often appear simple-minded to others. They cannot participate in religious instruction, business negotiations, or community discussions. These conditions didn't just affect your body. They determined your entire social position, your worth, your future. Whether you would live as a productive member of society or survive on its margins through the reluctant generosity of others. In first-century Palestine, disability wasn't a challenge to overcome. It was a life sentence to dependency and isolation. The fever breaks, but the questions begin. Why did God allow this to happen? What sin brought this punishment? How long will the family remain under divine judgment? Sickness was never just physical. Every illness carried spiritual weight that demanded explanation. When disease struck, families didn't just ask how to treat symptoms, they asked what they had done wrong. The dominant belief was simple and devastating. Suffering came from sin. Either your own sin or the sin of your parents visiting consequences on the next generation. A child born blind prompted the question Jesus heard, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" This theology offered dangerous comfort to the healthy. It suggested that good people stayed well while sinners got sick, but it placed unbearable guilt on the suffering. Every fever, every chronic condition, every disability became evidence of moral failure. Victims carried not just physical pain, but spiritual shame. Sudden, violent illnesses received different diagnosis: demonic possession, epileptic seizures, severe mental illness, and uncontrollable behaviors were seen as evidence that evil spirits had taken control of the person's body. The physical symptoms were merely external signs of a spiritual battle raging within. For women, certain conditions created ongoing ritual impurity. A woman with chronic bleeding, like the one who touched Jesus's cloak, lived in permanent uncleanness. She couldn't enter the temple, participate in religious festivals, or even touch her own family members without contaminating them. Her medical condition became a barrier between her and God Himself. Recovery required more than physical healing. It demanded ritual purification, sacrificial offerings, and priestly examination. Even after symptoms disappeared, The spiritual contamination had to be formally cleansed through elaborate ceremonies prescribed in religious law. Families walked a careful line between caring for sick relatives and protecting their own spiritual standing. Too much contact with the ritually unclean could compromise their ability to worship and participate in community religious life. This wasn't superstition overlaid on medical understanding. This was the medical understanding. Sickness was fundamentally a spiritual problem that required spiritual solutions. The body was simply the battlefield where divine justice, demonic attack, and human sin played out their eternal consequences. In this world, getting sick meant more than facing death. It meant confronting the possibility that God Himself had turned against you. When sickness struck, desperation drove families to try everything they could afford and everything they couldn't. The first response came from the women of the household. Mothers and grandmothers carried generations of accumulated wisdom about which plants could heal and which combinations might help. Fig poultices for boils and wounds, willow bark tea for fever and pain. They had no idea it contained compounds related to what we now call aspirin, but they knew it sometimes worked. Oil mixed with wine for cleansing cuts, honey for infected sores. These weren't random folk remedies. They were the distilled experience of countless mothers who had watched their children suffer and tried everything to save them. Some treatments actually helped. Many did nothing, but they represented hope in a world where hope was scarce. For families with money, physicians offered more sophisticated, but not necessarily more effective, interventions. These men had studied Greek medical texts that described the body's four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Disease meant these humors were out of balance. Treatment involved bleeding to reduce excess blood, purging to eliminate bad humors, and special diets to restore proper balance. The woman with the issue of blood had spent all she had on many physicians and was no better, but rather grew worse. Her experience wasn't unusual. Medical treatments were expensive, often painful, and frequently harmful. Bleeding weakened patients who needed strength. Purging dehydrated people who were already losing fluids. But physicians represented the best medical knowledge available. When human medicine failed, people turned to divine intervention. They made pilgrimages to healing springs and sacred pools like Bethesda in Jerusalem, where crowds of blind, lame, and paralyzed gathered hoping for miraculous healing. Families brought offerings to temples, made vows to God, and sought out holy men known for supernatural power. This wasn't desperation born of ignorance. This was practical strategy. In a world where medical knowledge was limited and often wrong, prayer and miracles represented genuine alternatives. The distinction between natural and supernatural healing meant nothing to someone watching their child die. The arrival of miracle workers like Jesus created enormous excitement precisely because conventional options were so inadequate. Here was someone who could heal instantly, completely, and without payment. Someone whose success rate surpassed any physician or treatment available. For most families facing serious illness, their medicine cabinet contained herbs from their garden, prayers to their God, and hope that somehow someone might possess the power to save the people they loved most. Jesus touches the leper's outstretched hand. With that single gesture, He doesn't just heal skin. He restores a human being to existence. The man hasn't felt another person's touch in years. He has lived outside the village walls, shouting warnings to keep others away, surviving on scraps left at a distance by family members who risk their own purity to keep him alive. His disease made him dead to society, while his heart still beat. Now Jesus speaks, "Be clean." The lesions fade, the discolored patches disappear. But the true miracle isn't medical, it's social. This man can return home, touch his children, enter the synagogue, participate in festivals. The healing restores not just his body, but his entire place in the human community. When Jesus gives sight to the blind beggar, he doesn't just restore vision, he gives back the ability to work, to contribute, to move through the world without depending on others' charity. The man who spent years asking for coins can now earn them. His healing transforms him from burden to participant in the economy of daily survival. The woman with chronic bleeding receives more than stopped hemorrhaging. For years, her condition made her ritually unclean, unable to worship, unable to touch family members, cut off from the religious life that gave meaning to existence. When Jesus heals her, he restores her relationship with God himself. This was why healing created such explosive response in first-century Palestine. These weren't just impressive medical interventions. They were resurrections of social death. Jesus wasn't simply curing diseases, he was giving people their lives back. Every healing challenged the fundamental assumption that sickness reflected divine judgment. If God was punishing these people for sin, why was Jesus reversing the punishment? His success suggested either that these sufferers weren't guilty as charged, or that God's mercy was more powerful than divine justice. The crowds that pressed around Jesus weren't drawn by curiosity about miraculous techniques. They came because conventional medicine had failed their loved ones. And this man offered what physicians could not: instant, complete, lasting restoration without payment or lengthy treatment. In a world where sickness meant spiritual contamination, social exile, economic ruin, and often death, healing represented the ultimate gift. Not just the return of health, but the return of hope, dignity, community, and future. When Jesus healed, he wasn't just fixing bodies. He was proclaiming that suffering people still belonged to God's family, still deserved love and inclusion, still possessed worth beyond their ability to contribute labor or avoid becoming burdens. These healings announced a different kind of kingdom, one where the sick were welcomed rather than expelled, where disability didn't determine destiny, where no one was too broken to deserve restoration. This world of fragility and fear shaped every family's daily reality. When a child developed a fever, parents faced not just medical crisis, but spiritual reckoning. When skin showed signs of disease, the entire family's social standing hung in the balance. When blindness or lameness struck, it meant a lifetime of dependency and marginalization. Understanding this backdrop transforms how we read the healing stories in the Gospels. Jesus wasn't just performing impressive medical interventions. He was restoring exiles to their communities, giving outcasts back their dignity, and proclaiming that sickness didn't disqualify people from God's love. Every touch of a leper violated social taboos. Every healing of blindness restored economic independence. Every cure of chronic illness reunited families torn apart by ritual purity laws. These weren't simply physical miracles, They were declarations that no one was too broken, too contaminated, or too burdensome to deserve restoration. The crowds that pressed around Jesus carried their own stories of failed remedies, expensive physicians, and desperate pilgrimages to healing shrines. They had exhausted their options and their savings. His healings offered what their world couldn't: instant, complete, lasting restoration without payment or punishment. In a society that saw sickness as divine judgment, Jesus' healing ministry proclaimed radical mercy. In communities that expelled the diseased to protect the healthy, he welcomed the suffering and proclaimed their worth. These healings weren't just about curing bodies, they were about redefining who belonged in God's kingdom. Next week, we'll explore another daily struggle these same families faced, surviving the brutal Palestinian winters without modern heating, insulation, or weatherproof shelter. We'll discover how cold wasn't just uncomfortable, it was life-threatening, and how entire households developed strategies just to make it through to spring. What aspect of ancient illness surprised you most? Share your thoughts below and join us as we continue uncovering the hidden realities of everyday life in Jesus' world.